Oh, come, let us Hello, Dallas. I'm Joshua Simonet, a pastor in the Baltimore area, and I serve on the teaching team here at Dallas. If you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad you're here with us. Pastor Brad is kicking off his Christmas series today, and I think we could really use some good news, which is what Christmas is all about. Also, Dallas is having a drive-in Christmas Eve service. I promise you are going to want to check that out. So visit dallaschurch.org for more information. Hey, I also wanted to give you guys a Blueprint update. Blueprint is the nonprofit that I started last year in Baltimore to help disrupt the school to prison pipeline. We're building out a mobile learning lab, and you guys helped us raise over $4,000 to help us buy iPads for this mobile unit. I'm so grateful to be in partnership with Dallas and can't wait to show you what your investment helped us create. Finally, I get a chance to speak again at Dallas in January. I'm super excited about this. I hope you would join us. Invite a friend. Merry Christmas.
We're in the final month of 2020. Thank God, right? I don't think it got here fast enough for probably every one of us. And I've heard this fall a lot of people talk about how they've never looked forward to a New Year's Eve as much as they are this year, to saying goodbye to one year and saying, a big hello to a new year, of course. And I noticed in November how many people said that they were going to decorate for Christmas early. Maybe that's because people are home and bored, but I think it really speaks to some of the anticipation, maybe like never before, of Christmas, or maybe appreciating Christmas like never before. I want to just invite those of you who maybe consider yourselves more skeptical about faith or the reality of God, or maybe the Christmas story itself. If you're one that asks questions like, did a virgin really give birth to a child that was also God, and grew up to die and then come back from the dead? Listen, we understand. You're not alone. We're a group of people here at Dallas Church who've grappled with those same kinds of questions. And I just want to invite you to join us all month long for this series where we're going to be considering some really good news. Now, I want to start the series by asking, when's the last time you received some good news, and what was it that made it good news? And maybe the question should be, can you remember receiving good news? And I'm saying it that way because I'm admitting something here, and I'm making a prediction. My prediction is I think that question is actually harder to answer than we would expect. And I know so, or at least in my case, because last week I knew I was going to ask you the question, hey, what's an example? When's the last time you got good news? Or what's an example of getting good news? So I, last week, asked myself the question and was going to list out just a few to share with you. And I'm not kidding you. I froze for 10, 15 seconds, maybe. I couldn't think of anything. It's like my brain went numb. And then the first example of receiving good news that came to my mind was from high school, when I was told by the orthodontist that my braces were going to come off the next month. I mean, that's embarrassing. And as awesome as that was, and I went home that day, and of course, before cell phones, and couldn't wait to get home and tell my family, hey, I got really good news today. My braces come off in a month. As awesome as that was, it's really sad. And I think it's part of the reality of the world that we live in. We don't live in a world where we think naturally good news. I think we live in a bad news-centric world. Now, this is just my hypothesis here. I believe a lot of our conversation and mental energy is skewed toward the negative that's happening, the negative that's being reported, the bad news that's reported. Certainly, the media and social media has really become a grounds, a platform for negative behavior by other people and our own thoughts. And listen, we live in a time, and I think it's hard for us to think this way. It maybe isn't natural us to think. We live in an era of good news, and you and I are recipients of good news that actually affects our future. So I want to talk today first of all, to set up the series about what news is. And just hearing that, please don't check out if you are like, seriously, Brad's going to talk about what news is. We all know what news is. I actually have some observations to make about that relate to what we're going to look at this Christmas season. So, one observation is how we have the same instinct. I believe our initial instinct towards good news and bad news is the same, and that is an instinct of hope or the wishful thinking kind of hope. When we hear good news, we hope it's true. When we hear bad news, we hope it's not true. So here's an example I'm just making up. If we hear tomorrow in the news that there's been a medical report released, let's say it's the New England Journal of Medicine reports, I'm already regretting this example, that studies show that eating apple pie and eating pumpkin pie lowers cholesterol and prevents diabetes. Yeah, I'm regretting this example. I think if that went across credible news agencies or sources tomorrow, we would, all of us, hope that's good news. I hope to God that's good news. I think that would be our instinct. Now, let me give a serious, not a silly, a serious example of a bad news, our instinct of reacting to bad news, hoping it's not true. Last year, about this time, we as a church community gathered to package meals together. We joined Generosity Feeds to package 2,500 meals. And in that cafeteria, somebody walked up to me during that event and said, "Did you hear the news?" And I said, "No, what news?" And they said, "Kobe Bryant was killed today in a helicopter crash." And I just froze. I remember feeling kind of that. I was never even really a big Lakers fan, but as a sports fan, I remember freezing, and my reaction was, that can't be true, or I hope that's not true. And in this social media world of rumors, I was hoping to go home and find out that that was a lie, and of course it wasn't. I think that's our natural instinct towards good and bad news, to hope the good is true and to hope the bad isn't. Okay, here's another observation. Just a quick one, that our news sources today tend to be very biased. Now, the election's over. I don't want to mention politics other than to say we'd be hard-pressed to find big news sources, news agencies that aren't either left-leaning or right-leaning. And when you stop to think about what news is, what the function of news is, and what proper news is, and this is really an observation of journalism, it's ridiculous that news sources, even small town papers, endorse presidential candidates. I mean, that's really a violation of what pure news is supposed to be. Okay, one more observation here before we get into some of the excitement that we're going to be celebrating this month. And this is the observation I've made here maybe over the last 5 years, especially the last 3 or 4 years, I think. And that is the use of the technique of breaking news. Breaking news is used by cable networks, especially daily, like every day. They use it as a technique every day. There are a couple news sources that I am pretty sure use it hourly. I think they use breaking news coming off the top of the hour or coming out of commercial breaks at least once an hour. Listen, when I was a kid, growing up in the late 70s and the 80s, when I was in my 20s, maybe even my 30s, when breaking news would happen a couple times a year, maybe 3 times a year. And if you're 30 or 35 years old or older, you may have the same reaction to the words, "We interrupt this program." Even me just saying that might kind of freeze you, like, oh, those were paralyzing words when I was a kid. Across the screen, I'm looking at my own television here. Across the screen, the text would be breaking news, but what we would hear would be, "We interrupt this program." And if you heard those words, you knew and would probably say, oh boy, something big has happened and it's probably bad. I remember the breaking news where I was when the news broke that from Cape Canaveral that the space shuttle had exploded. I remember exactly where I was when breaking news from downtown DC that President Reagan had been shot. It's sad that journalism has taught some of our young generations here today, our younger generation, that we can report on what are really details, minor details, as breaking news, as a way of inflating a detail to be something big or good news or bad news, because it does skew us away from, I think it tempers or it compromises our appreciation of pure news, particularly news that's really good. So let's talk about what news is. I've worked hard as a dad at teaching my girls what news is and what news isn't. News is not advice. It's not suggestions. News should never be an opinion. This is what news is. News is about something that happened. That's the first element of what news is. It's about an event, something that's actually occurred. News is always about something that's happened that changes things, that makes things different or new. That's why it's news. It's an event that's happened that makes things new. And then the third element is that affects the future. It actually, in many cases, leads to different behavior or even decision making that's different. News is not ever breaking news. This is an example I'll use, and then I'm going to move into scripture. An example from this year, breaking news. I paid attention and tuned in for those 10 seconds. The breaking news was that the Fed chair had announced interest rates were not changing. That's actually technically not news. It might be important, but it's information. It's actually an update. We should call that an update, not news, and certainly not breaking news. What we are given in the scriptures about the coming of Jesus, the arrival of Jesus, is actually news. And I want to begin with Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is 750 years back in the Old Testament before the birth of Jesus, 750 years before Jesus was born. It's relevant to mention someone from the Old Testament because he actually introduces, centuries ahead of time, the good news that will arrive on planet Earth. And he tells it as good news, even though it's not an event that's already happened. He says there will be a generation in the future who will say, wow, it's happened. The Messiah has arrived. We see him. We've experienced him. In many cases, we've actually touched him. That generation is coming, Isaiah said, 750 years before the birth of Jesus. And in all the destruction and calamity and brokenness that we're experiencing in our lifetime, Isaiah says, because of the brokenness and selfishness of humanity, the good news that I'm announcing is that God is moving forward with his love and his forgiveness and his movement to rescue all humans. God hasn't given up on that, and it will come by way of a Messiah, a rescuer. In fact, Isaiah gives us this beautiful poetic picture. This is one of the ways that Isaiah presents the good news to us, even foretelling it, as in the ruins of destroyed Jerusalem, the remnant of the people who were in the city could hear someone coming down, descending out of the mountains, and faintly they could hear him yelling, "Good news, good news." And the closer he got, the louder it got. "Good news, there's good. I'm bringing good news to these hurting people who had experienced such heartache. They are being brought good news." And this is Isaiah's poetic way of introducing the Christmas story to us. It's precisely why he gives us the text of Isaiah 52:7, where he says, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation." In ancient times, when the men of a village or town would go to battle, of course the town and village would anxiously await word on the outcome of the battle. And when the outcome was known, what commonly happened was marathon runners would run as fast as they could, sometimes 15 miles, sometimes 25 miles or 30 miles, to report to the town the outcome. And if it was good news, the runner would not wait until he arrived to the town and pant, and he'd probably bend over and fall over he would actually yell from the distance as he's arriving, "Good news, good news. I'm bringing good news." And that's why Isaiah uses this description. Why are the feet, that's such odd language. Why are the feet in Isaiah 52:7 beautiful? Because they carry good news. God has not given up on humanity in all of our selfishness, in all of our ugliness and brokenness. He is moving forward in his plan of love and rescue of the human soul. Now, I want to go into what are called the gospel writers. Now, this is important. Stay with me on this. It just reveals the relevance of how Christmas was given to us by way of news. Gospel is a word that we don't use anymore. It's not a part of our everyday language. It's an Old English word, the Anglo-Saxon derivative or translation from what a lot of the Bible writers gave us. Gospel meant gosp, good, and spell telling or story, good story. And the gospel writers really should be called, in our day, in our vernacular, in our everyday language, good news writers. So we say the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark. What we would say normally in our day, outside of church tradition, would be the good news of Matthew, the good news of Mark. Now, gospel was the translation from the original. In Jesus' day, people who wrote the records of Jesus, encounters of Jesus, eyewitness accounts of Jesus, when people interviewed many who had experienced the reality of Jesus and they wrote it down, they wrote in Greek. And the Greek word was euangelion. Euangelion literally means good news, remarkable news. So I want to look at the remarkable news of Matthew, of Mark, of Luke, and John here this month. And I'm going to introduce it with the very first gospel writer or good news writer, Matthew. In Matthew chapter 1, he tells of the good news that's brought to Mary and Joseph. And of course, they were frightened and freaked out, but then they realized, oh, wow, this is actually life-changing news for the whole world. And they leaned into the story and became part of the story of Jesus' arrival. Well, in chapter 4, Matthew says Jesus went throughout Galilee. This is really important. He goes throughout Galilee. Galilee was, to be kind of crude, Galilee was like an armpit of sorts in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire benefited, certainly not in any meaningful financial way, from Galilee. This is a group of impoverished people who herded sheep and farmed to make ends meet. These were marginalized people in Galilee. Jesus intentionally goes to Galilee, to the Galileans, to people like you and me. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news. Now, in the Greek, this was euangelion. In the Old English, several hundred years ago, it would have been the gospel. In our language, it's translated the good news, the remarkable news of his kingdom. And he doesn't just proclaim it. He doesn't just stand up as a politician and promise something or declare there's good news coming. Jesus actually lives it out. The rest of this verse, he proclaims the good news of God's kingdom and healing. He went through Galilee healing every disease and sickness among the people. This is so remarkable because sick people in Galilee were thought by Romans and certainly by the religious leaders to be unclean. They were spiritually unclean. Their parents had done something of a sinful nature or something that violated the gods, and they were cursed with sickness or illness. This is precisely who Jesus goes to. The verse ends, among the people. Jesus doesn't come to just proclaim verbally the good news. He takes good news to the lowest, to the marginalized, the forgotten, those with regrets and hurts and mistakes, and those in extreme poverty. That's the kind of kingdom we're being introduced to at the beginning of the Christmas story. I want to go to Mark, the good news of Mark. In the Old English, we'd say the Gospel of Mark, the good news of Mark. Mark chapter 1, verse 1, the very first verse of Mark's account of Jesus' life. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, in Roman times, it was incredibly rare that a biography would be written about anyone's life. It was extremely rare. In our day, modern times, in the 21st century, we could write about anybody's life sitting in our house. That would never be understood in Roman times, in ancient times, certainly not in a place like Judea or Galilee. It was incredibly expensive to write a biography because if you're doing the work of real news, you're traveling to meet with people who experienced the event or who witnessed what occurred. That cost travel time and work time, and it cost money, of course. I mean, today we have tools at our disposal. Notebooks and pens are ubiquitous. Google Drive and Google Docs and Apple and Microsoft. I mean, it's super easy. Even social media, it's so easy for us to tell the story of someone. Let me ask you, how many writers are recording your life story right now? I bet I know the answer. I don't know of anyone who's recording the events of my life. And I bet the answer for you is also zero. It's amazing that not just Matthew and not just Mark, it's not just two. Two would be significant. If two people alone recorded the events of Jesus' life, told the news, the good news, as they're both introducing here, it would be pretty remarkable. I mean, that's the stuff of an emperor or a significant political leader. Luke tells us it's many. It's not even just the four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Luke starts his account with the word many. The very first verse begins with the first word, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. We don't know how many is, but we know that it's a lot because villages and towns and regions and across the Mediterranean Sea, news about Jesus is spreading like wildfire. And that is because many are taking on the expense and doing the hard work of meeting with people and hearing the stories and writing down, in some cases, personal experiences with Jesus, and in other cases, eyewitness accounts. It's interesting what Luke goes on to say. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Verse 2, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke was not a disciple of Jesus and a personal eyewitness of Jesus like Matthew was or like John was. Luke, in the next generation, which I think just lends itself to the credibility of the accounts that we have of the Christmas story in the life of Jesus. Someone from the next generation did the work of investigating, which we're going to learn here, to really become confident in himself, so much so that he actually records a record of the life of Jesus. So I kind of took the words out of Luke's mouth. Just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write, I too meaning along with many other people, as Luke said in verse 1, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. We don't know a whole lot about Theophilus. Luke mentions him again in the book of Acts. He's clearly a follower of Jesus, someone who believes in Jesus and is following him. But the context here tells us that Theophilus is looking to boost his faith, to grow his faith, to become even more confident in what he believes through eyewitness accounts and other accounts of people who were changed by Jesus. And so that's why Luke is writing this orderly account. As emotional as each of the record takers were, like Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, the closest they get to any personal bias is just in their opening words. I want to start by saying, I have remarkable news to share. And then they go through the process of actually news reporting is essentially, I mean, this isn't journalism, but they are doing the actual work of presenting news through organized, corroborated record keeping of events that have happened. This really strengthened my faith. So much so, and that's why Luke is writing to Theophilus. In verse 4, he says, I do this, writing this orderly account after all the investigation, so that you, Theophilus, in verse 4, may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. And then Luke begins the Christmas story. Verse 5, in the time of Herod. I want to challenge you today as we begin this Christmas season together. In this way, I I think we get out of our stuckness and actually our spiritual stuckness and stepping into the space of God's reality when we move out of the space of tradition and religious obligation, and I'll even say irrelevant religion. We move out of the headspace of, well, I celebrate Christmas because of the agenda of a religious book. It's sad that so many people see the Bible that way, or they understand that that's what the Bible is, that it's an agenda, a religious book with an agenda. You and I move into the space of experiencing the reality of Jesus and him actually not only being active in our lives where we can see him at work in our relationships and in the periphery of our own life, but where we see him changing us. We experience him in our soul changing us in our character and our ability to love greater than we ever thought that we could, our ability to forgive, our ability to serve and serve strangers. We step and move into that space when we move out of the idea that we celebrate Christmas or we understand Jesus the Messiah because of tradition or because some book a long time ago told us we're supposed to have Christmas. It all hinges on whether you and I make our beginning point, even in our worship this season, when we make the beginning point, the news of Jesus' arrival. Many people telling us events that happened, that actually occurred, and how it made things different. It made things new, and how it changes the future. And it changes our future. We're going to spend time this month talking about that. Listen, we're going to celebrate on Christmas Eve. Those in the Dulles area, I'm challenging all of you, just inviting is the word. I'm inviting all of you to join us in person on Christmas Eve for our drive-in. We're going to be safely in our cars. You can choose to stay in your car the whole time. We're planning to get out of our cars. Those who are comfortable at the end for Silent Night. For those watching in different parts of the country or out of the Dulles area, we're going to be online just like always on Christmas Eve. But this whole month we're celebrating, and I don't want to just go through the routine of what we normally celebrate at Christmas. We sing the songs, we tell the stories, because that's what religion tells us we're supposed to do. Before there was ever a book called the Bible, we were introduced to the news that something had happened that changes everything and makes everything new and affects our futures. If it's true, if it's actually true what so many gave up so much of their lives to describe about the life of Jesus, if it's true, then it means Jesus has the ability to change our world into a world of good, into a whole new world of good, starting with you. So let me pray with you. God, this Christmas season, we invite you to alter our thinking and maybe just our habits and take us back to where this all began with the news, the actual eyewitness accounts of something that happened, something that occurred that changed many, many lives and actually impacts the future for all humans, for all of us. I pray, God, that we would make that the beginning point of our worship, that we would step out of religion, we would step out of even just mindless traditions if they hold us back, and we would go to the original source of the news that was told to us about your Son, about Jesus. Amen. I love you, Dulles family. I'm excited to do this month with you, and I'm looking forward to Christmas Eve, the Christmas Eve drive-in with you. Have a great week, everybody. I'll see you online this week.